Emily packed her things in a rush and ran over to her great love's home, Clyde. Lewis had struck her for the last time, and she would finally be happy. Her bruises were painful, but it was dull compared to the fear she felt if Lewis would ever find them together. Relief washed over her with each step closer to the love of her life. This would not be their home much longer, but he was her home. Wherever they fled to, they would be together. Clyde is shocked to see his beautiful Emily riddled with bruises from her abusive husband. He clung to her and reassured her that she was safe now. Clyde listened intently to the details of Emily's encounter with Lewis. With each word he heard, he knew they must leave Henford-on-Bagley very soon. It was a small town, and the residents would soon notice Emily living there and would report back to Lewis. They would figure out the details later. For now they would take comfort that they were finally together and that Emily was safe. Clyde waited in his room while Emily soaked in the bath. He wanted her to take her time and finally feel peace. A little relaxation is just what Emily needed. Emily washed away all of the bad memories and feelings of worthlessness she experienced with Lewis. This was her fresh start to be with a man who truly loved her. She did not care that they needed to change their names or flee. They were together. Emily looked at herself in the mirror. This was the last time she would not recognize herself in the mirror. The last time she would ever have a bruise that was caused by another. She was finally out of a terrible situation. Clyde comforted the love of his life. It would take time and effort to allow her to heal and fully feel safe, but Clyde had all the time in the world. They had the rest of their lives ahead of them. Until then, they would drown out the rest of the world and their fears with lovemaking, with everything else in their lives undetermined and unsure. Their love was the only constant. They allowed themselves 2 weeks to prepare for their departure. Clyde put Philip's house on the market, so they would have enough money to buy a modest home. They decided Brindleton Bay would be their new home. It was the perfect place to stay hidden and have children. Emily was having a hard time with her faith. She was confused why God would allow her to have such a troubled life. And the only way she could be happy with Clyde was to flee their home. Life was too unfair to have a God. Clyde cooked he and Emily an elaborate breakfast the morning before their big move. Clyde had paid a dodgy man to create new identities for he and Emily. Philip's home had been sold the day prior. Their new lives were shaping up very nicely. Emily set the table for their breakfast. Clyde informed her of their new identities. They were now Thomas and Elizabeth Benedict. Clyde was able to purchase a falsified marriage license, so they were a married couple as Thomas and Elizabeth. The fake newly married couple basked in the comfort of this house for one last night. Clyde would really miss this house and Henford-on-Bagley because it was the only town he had ever known. He was anxious to live so far away from his sisters, but knew this was the right thing. In the wee hours of the morning right before the sun came up, they played their instruments. Both felt the wave of nostalgia while playing, as this was how they fell in love with each other. Music had brought them closer together, and both would miss playing in this room together. As the sun began to rise, Clyde Bennett and Emily Booker, or now legally known as Thomas and Elizabeth Benedict, fled Henford-on-Bagley with nothing but the clothes on their backs and 2 suitcases. They would soon be the newest residents. Clyde and Emily felt so happy and safe once they finally arrived at their new home in Brindleton Bay. They had only arrived minutes ago, but they already felt at home. They were safe from Lewis. This is the home they would build a family in. The couple hugged the other in relief. Clyde repeatedly reassured his love that she was safe now. They could finally be together and love each other freely. Emily clung to those words, hoping he was right. They allowed themselves to let loose and be free. barely making it in the front door before making love. Clyde took a bath that first night and couldn't believe his good fortune. He was able to love Emily freely in Brindleton Bay without fear of harm. They were healthy and happy, and that was all that mattered. Emily had a hard time adjusting to life in Brindleton Bay. She was unhappy as Elizabeth and Thomas and desperately wanted to live as Emily and Clyde. She didn't dare share these thoughts with Clyde because he went to such great lengths to make this happen. All of those unsure feelings went away when Clyde looked at her with such love and smiled at her with ease. It was an adjustment, but all of it was worth it because she had the opportunity to love and be loved by a good man. They were the lucky ones because they had a great love in their life. After the newness of their home wore off, Clyde began to struggle with his faith. In the eyes of the Lord, they were living in sin, and they legally could not get married while she was still married to Lewis. Their children would be bastards, and that was something Clyde needed to come to terms with. Emily decided to try her hand at gardening. They had come to the conclusion that it would be safer for them not to go into town unless they had to, so growing their own produce would save many trips to the market, and besides, Emily found she loved to garden. In the months following the uprooting of their lives and move to Brindleton Bay, the couple adjusted to living together. The couple were so used to sneaking around and hiding their love for the other that it was a strange and foreign feeling to actually live together. They had to find a balance between alone time and time with each other. They loved to play chess together and watch the sun set around them. They had all the time in the world to learn every detail about the other, each parcel of information made each happy that they fell in love with the other. Both agreed that adding a child or two into their lives someday soon is something they desired. A child's laughter would liven up their home that had yet to feel cheerful. Clyde started smoking regularly to cope with his struggling faith. He had abandoned the church and congregation that Philip spent his whole life building. He felt unbelievable guilt. He was no longer a faithful follower of God and would never preach again. Despite the couple each suffering in silence about the changes in their lives that they were having a hard time with, they still managed to maintain an active love life in the bedroom. Sometimes it was the only thing that was right in the world. Even fast asleep, they could not be without the other. Unconscious hands always found the other for comfort. Emily adjusted to the quiet and secluded life in Brindleton Bay. It was an adjustment period to not constantly look over her shoulder or to actually feel safe, but she was starting to like her life with Clyde. Doing the laundry was tedious and time-consuming, but it had to be done. Besides, Clyde's dirty clothes were not nearly as disgusting as Lewis's, so she counted her blessings. After Clyde had decided that he would never be a preacher again, he went back to his roots. He began woodworking so he could sell the pieces in town. He had forgotten how peaceful woodworking was and how much he enjoyed it. His woodworking had also improved so much since his teen years, so he was making a decent living by selling what he was making. He did miss the church though. Emily was beginning to enjoy cooking. It always felt like a chore when she was married to Lewis because it was expected of her, but Clyde was thankful for every meal and praised Emily for the food. Feeling wanted and appreciated was something Emily had never felt in her life before Clyde. Her favorite part of the day was to work on her garden. She was still learning the basics of how to keep the plants alive, but she was slowly yet surely figuring it out. It was her peace. Emily started to experience morning sickness. She remembered that her mother would always experience this when she was with child. She desperately hoped that this meant she had and Clyde's first child in her belly. She vigorously cleaned the toilet because she did not want Clyde to know unless she was sure. Clyde was very excited to be a father. and she didn't want to get his hopes up if there was no baby. She scrubbed herself in the tub while she daydreamed of the life that she and Clyde could possibly have sooner rather than later. She knew Clyde would be such a great father, and she wanted to give that gift to him. She did not know if she would be a good mother, but she would try. Some days Clyde did not finish his woodworking until the early morning hours, so he often ate dinner by himself. He did not mind the time to himself. Sometimes he would pray even though he felt like God was no longer listening to him. Living together had done wonders for the new couple's intimacy. They no longer had to worry about someone seeing them be in love, so they could freely express that. And they did, in every room and every inch of their home. This was still a new experience for Clyde, and he could not get enough of it. The vigorous activity would upset her stomach, and she would have to excuse herself to the bathroom to vomit. Emily spent some of her days completely by herself because those were days when Clyde was in town selling his woodworking pieces. If this would have happened with Lewis, she would have been worried sick that he was cheating, but she did not have this feeling with Clyde. She trusted Clyde with her whole heart, and she knew that he was not capable of hurting her in that way. So instead of worrying, she keeps their home tidy so Clyde would come home to a clean home and a loving wife. She made dinner every night and hoped that Clyde would get home in time, so they could enjoy a meal together. It only happened a handful of times. She longed for there to be a baby in her belly so she would not be alone all of the time anymore. After vomiting once, Emily had forgotten to clean her mess because she was ravenous. Clyde discovered the sick and cleaned the toilet for his love, suddenly curious what was going on. Emily was eating by the fire and thinking of their future family. She had not yet missed her monthly, but she expected to in the next few days. Clyde sat his love down and asked if she was okay. Noting the vomit left behind, Emily explained that there was a possibility that she was with child, but begged Clyde not to get too excited yet. He promised not to, but he already had such a large smile on his face. It was his dream to have children and to raise them differently from how he was raised, and now that might be his reality. Sure enough, 2 days later her monthly did not come. She was never late, so this was confirmation that she was with child on the inside. She was so happy and relieved to be pregnant with their first child. However, her hormones were rampant and she was stressed out. To calm her nerves, she went outside to the garden and planted new crops for fall. After her hormones subsided, she celebrated her joyous bundle of joy with playing upbeat music on the piano. She hasn't played music since they had moved to Brindleton Bay, so her happiness was off the charts. Although she just found out she was with child, she decided it was never too early to knit baby clothes for their child. She wanted to knit clothing of every color despite her longing for a son. She would be happy either way. All of this excitement was occurring while Clyde was in town selling his woodworking pieces. He came home with zero idea of the news Emily would soon announce. Emily cooked Clyde his favorite meal, a turkey feast, to celebrate the news that she was with child. Clyde stood behind her and inquired the reason for making this meal like he was a giddy child. Emily shooed him out of the kitchen so she could finish cooking the meal, to busy himself. Clyde set the table and prayed that Emily was making this extravagant dinner because they were going to be parents. Emily called Clyde to eat when the meal was finished. She was so excited to share her news with her dear Clyde. When she told him, he cried tears of joy. He told her that he had been searching for a purpose since leaving the church. Their child would be just that. They eat their meal happily together, feeling such serenity that they would soon be parents. Clyde hoped for a girl while Emily wished for a baby boy. This would become a playful competition of who'd be right. Their table would soon be filled with children. Not just the two of them anymore. Clyde insisted from this moment on. He would make Emily's life easier. He would do any of the housework that she was too tired to do. He would do anything to make the love of his life comfortable and happy. Emily watched her great love in awe. She couldn't believe that she had finally achieved happiness, and they were soon going to have a baby in their arms. That night, Emily and Clyde cuddled on the couch and spoke of the life their unborn child would have. Clyde mentioned that his father had always had a plan for him, and he had hated it, so there would never be a plan for their children, just that they were happy. Their conversation shifted from serious to silly, and Clyde tickled his girl, as it often did. Their interaction turned intimate in nature. They celebrated the pregnancy exactly how the child had been made. In the bedroom, Clyde began to fix all of the appliances and broken furniture in their home in preparation for the little bundle of joy that would make their appearance in a few short months. He was already doing his best to be a responsible and hands-on father. He was also working his hands to the bone in order to make a little extra money before their child was born. He wanted to be able to spend as much time with Emily and their baby before having to work again. He was also working on a crib for their little one, which Clyde would soon surprise Emily with. He was so proud that his child would lay in something he constructed with his own two hands. Working all of these long hours was hard on Clyde, however. All of his aches and pains melted away when he was able to slide into bed next to his dear Emily, whose sleeping, searching hands found him in. Immediately, Emily was having a bout of sadness due to her changing hormones. Being nauseous all the time did not help those feelings, and she was miserable. Clyde told her there was a surprise for her in the nursery, so she went in the room. All of her troubles with her pregnancy became worth it when she saw the bassinet that Clyde had built from scratch. A child would soon sleep in that very crib. That little moment changed the trajectory of her pregnancy for good. As miserable as she was carrying she and Clyde's little miracle, and she would do so with grace and gratitude. She then did something she had not done in a long time. She prayed to God to watch over her baby. Much of her time was spent only dressed in her nightgown and knitting. Her clothes had become too snug to wear, and she wanted to be comfortable. She was knitting so frequently that they had enough baby clothes for 10 children to wear. She even had calluses on her fingers from all the knitting. Clyde liked to warm himself by the fire when he got home from selling his woodworking pieces in town. This is where he would talk to God and ask him to watch over Emily and their child. Just like Emily had done all those months previously, Clyde finally picked up his violin. It had been collecting dust in the corner since they moved to Brindleton Bay. He felt the sense of peace and nostalgia when he played the instrument. It brought him back to when he fell in love with Emily. Clyde received a letter from his sister, Esmeralda, addressed to Thomas Benedict. He was happy to hear from her, but didn't like when his sisters wrote to him in fear that Lewis would figure out their new identities and find them. However, she was not writing with good news. She wrote to Clyde to inform him that their little brother, Christian, had tragically passed away in a freak accident involving a horse. This left their father with no living heir, and Joseph was looking for Clyde to come back to the farm. He immediately rushed to Emily to tell her the terrible news of his little brother. His heart broke for Christian's twin sister, and for Summer. He felt nothing for his father. He and Emily agreed that he would not contact his father nor be his heir again. After everything his father put him through, he would not give him the satisfaction of controlling his life again. He wanted Joseph going to his grave with the understanding that he had failed to have a male heir, the one thing he had worked towards his whole life. Weeks went by, and Emily was heavily pregnant now. She had been having a difficult time getting comfortable in their bed, so she would sometimes travel to the couch in the middle of the night in an attempt to find comfort. At this point in her pregnancy, she was beginning to feel very dizzy, to the point where she would need to sit down to keep from toppling over. She figured this was simply a normal symptom of pregnancy, so she drank water to subside the feeling. At the prompting of Clyde, she would slow down and take it easy during the remaining month of her pregnancy. She would do anything to ensure the health and safety of her child.